In this series we are now entering an era when, for the first time in several centuries, the Occident began to expand in all directions. And for this same reason we are also entering a period of contemporary controversy. The dominant view, which has been growing more pronounced since the 1950s, has been that the expansion of Christendom during the Middle Ages was a disgraceful episode, an unprovoked assault upon peace-loving native peoples in far-off lands, who had been minding their own business before the mounted knights of the Crusades arrived to spread terror in their midst. Further, this movement of expansion is condemned for being fueled by naked greed, by ethnocentrism, and religious fanaticism of the worst kind. Since the 1950s, we have not liked our past, and strive to distance ourselves from it by multiple means. Countless histories, historical novels, tourist guides, and popular history television documentaries express this sensibility. We, naively, project our recently acquired moral convictions backwards in time, to judge censoriously the attitudes and actions of our ancestors living a whole millennium ago. But perhaps after half a century of historical self-loathing, we can begin to move beyond such simplistic attitudes and turn our minds to trying to understand a society that existed 1,000 years ago, which, though our predecessor, did not share our philosophical or our moral assumptions. We should approach such a society with the carefulness of an anthropologist, that is, without bringing our moralizing prejudices to bear, but bringing instead an open intellectual curiosity. While the Roman Empire continued its centuries-long struggle to preserve itself against Islam in the East, the Occident had known no overarching state power for the previous 600 years. The result was a chronic political anarchy. That anarchy had been subdued by the Carolingians when at their height, but the radical political fragmentation and external predation of the century 850 to 950 had more than undone what order existed. Even after the Saracens, Vikings and Magyars had been repulsed or tamed, anarchy, violence and cruelty prevailed on a local level as a condition of life for the warrior caste. Violence, or the exercise of arms, was held in the highest honour next to the profession of the priesthood. A whole culture of the celebration of personal prowess and the marking of the pathos of heroic death flourished and found expression in the chansons de geste of the period. Here is a stanza from the most famous of them, the Chanson de Roland. Its first line goes, quote, Sansun lidux il ve ferir al masur, and the last is, Dist l'archevêque, sist colp est de baron. The translation would be, the Duke Sanson charged to strike al mature. His buckler decorated with gold and flowers he smashed. His robust cuirass hardly protected him at all, as he was pierced through the heart, the liver and the lungs, so that he was struck down dead, whether one deplores it or not. The Archbishop said, that blow came from a true baron. In the distant past, that is in late Latin, a baro or baron originally meant a free man as opposed to a slave, a man entitled to bear arms. It took on the meaning of valiant warrior and later came to be a title of high nobility. But in this verse we can capture some of the ethos of the 11th century society of warrior landholders, the celebration of violence, of bravery under stress, of person-to-person mortal combat. This was, in their view, the origin and justification of their right, their freedom, of their landholdings and their exactions. It was their reason for living, to live honourably in the esteem of their peers. In the 900s and 1000s, the whole of society groaned under the conditions of perpetual low-level warfare and ruthless predation. Communities formed themselves into tight, self-regulating defensive associations, as cities with their extremely expensive stone walls, and as villages with their formidable thorn-branch palisades. Indeed, our English word town derives via Flemish from the Germanic word zaun, meaning thorn, for this very reason. Here is the chronicler Fulcher de Chartres opening his account of the background of the First Crusade. Anno ab incarnatione Domino millesimo nonagesimo quinto, cum in universis Europae partibus mala multimoda. In the 1095th year of the incarnation of the Lord, evils of all kinds desolated all parts of Europe. Pope Urban II saw more clearly than anyone that the great ones of the land, terrarum principus, were always in arms, that sometimes these ones and other times those made cruel warfare, destroying the peace everywhere and pillaging again and again the goods of the earth." End quote. And it was these same lords, great and small, despite their belief in their own right to take what they had the means to steal, who believed most vehemently in the message and authority of the Church. For over a century before the 1090s, the Church had been organizing the Pax Dei, or Trêve de Dieu movement, peace of God. Fighting was forbidden on Sundays. The persons of the clergy, being without arms, were to be immune from attack or spoliation, as was the often fortified property of the Church. By extension, pilgrims, peregrini, those who wandered far from home, and with them mercatores, merchants, defenseless people travelling the always dangerous roads between centres of community and security, were to remain also untouched, at least for certain specified days of the week and for a certain period. It was like trying to issue a restricted season hunting license. Women, old people and children, together with monks and priests, were to be out of bounds for the marauding local lords. The Peace of God movement had been promoted and preached in favour of for well over a century. The contradiction at the heart of Occidental society between its violent and cruel social conditions and its ideals of Christian unity and of loving one's neighbour was becoming ever more clearly articulated and exposed. At the same time, and intimately intertwined with it, the Peace of God movement, led by the bishops and encouraged by the Bishop of Rome, was part of the great revolution in the relationship between the Latin Christian Church and the power politics of the great aristocratic families. The papacy led the Church to assert rights it had never had: the right to stamp out simony, the payment by candidates of this or that aristocratic faction for high church offices, especially bishoprics. The prelacy of the Reform movement wanted the Church to be independent of the power of local lords and even of kings and emperors. It wanted to enjoy its ancient rights of libertas, its freedom from interference. Fulcher tells us that Pope Urban passionately exhorted the 310 bishops and abbots gathered at Clermont in Auvergne to, quote, "conserve the Church firmly, and all those of every rank attached to it, in complete independence of every secular power. See to it that the tithe, or 10th part, of all the fruits of the earth is faithfully paid, as the true property of God himself. And as for those who imprison or despoil monks, priests, and religious, and their servants, or pilgrims and merchants, they should be excommunicated." End quote. A hierarchy was fought for and imposed. The bishops, and to an extent the abbots, came under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Rome. He, if anyone, was the one to whom they had to answer. He would legitimize new bishops in their offices, and by implication could depose them. This began to turn the Latin Church into a vast hierarchical and jurisdictional organization, spanning the whole of the Occident, as an integral institution, independent of local power conditions. It began, in potential, to look like a universal, centrally directed, autonomous sphere, with some of the order and power that the Roman Imperium once had. The Western Church was still plagued, though, even in the reign of Pope Urban II, 1088 to 1099, by the same old disease. Fulcher tells us that an antipope, the client of the Western Emperor, one Guibertus, ruled in pomp from Ravenna as Clement III. Urban fought him off by seizing the initiative, by holding the Great Council of the Latin Church at Piacenza in 1095, denouncing simony, calling for the independence of the Church, and receiving the ambassadors of the Roman Emperor at Constantinople, Alexius I. 8 months later, Urban was at Claromontem, or Clermont, presiding over the aforementioned Church Council. Clermont was not in France, as we automatically assume, but in Gallias, in the Gauls, as Fulcher says. It was a city within Burgundy. The Pope was in conflict with the Western Emperor, and no German bishops attended. He was also in conflict with the King of Francia, lying north of the Loire, both of whom he had excommunicated, the first for simony and the second for adultery. This tells us something about the realities of power at the time. The audience to whom Urban appealed from Clermont was all of Latin Christendom, apart from its two nominal secular power holders, the Western Emperor Enricus IV and the Frankish King Philip I. There was a layer beneath and beside these, independent lords willing to act without the say-so of anyone. These were the Count of Toulouse, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Blois and Chartres, the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Normandy, the Prince of Taranto, and thousands of lesser lords and their knights. Pope Urban, at the moment when many major strands of development were coming together, stepped forward to occupy the empty space, to seize the political as well as the moral leadership of Latin Christendom. Why did the response to the call for the Crusade take the pattern it did? Neither Spain, Germany, nor England took part in the First Crusade, simply because these entities didn't then exist, in the sense that we know them now. France, in our sense, also didn't exist. It is futile to seek national components in an 11th century movement. England, as Anglia Terra, or Angleterre, came closest to our modern conceptions of a political community, precisely because it had been invaded and thoroughly conquered as a single medieval dominion, as a regnum or royaume, just as southern Italy and Sicily had been by the Norman lords. The thoroughness of this conquest made of England the most coherent of all medieval polities, and was to leave its permanent mark on the island up to the present day. Spain did not participate in the First Crusade because A. there was no Spain, but as contemporaries said, Spain's. There was Barcelona, Aragon, Navarre, Castile, Leon, Portugal, and B. a full-blown frontier war was already afoot between Islam and Christendom in central and northern Iberia. Germany didn't exist as a single political entity until 800 years after this time, not until 1871. The Alps and the linguistic legacies of the Roman Empire made it natural to perceive of two broad regions, of Germania and Italia. Italia meant central and northern Italy. Both were elements of the Western Imperium Romanum, or Roman Empire, revived by Otto I in the 960s. But nowhere within either was there a single or coherent political structure. Within Germania, the great regional dukes operated semi-independent dominions entirely of their own. In the first place, the great bishops of Metz, Cologne, and Trier, as well as those of Toul and Salzburg, and the dukes or Fürsten of Saxony, Swabia, Schwaben, Bavaria, Franconia, Thuringia, and Lotharingia, or Lorraine. Each of these owed vassalic allegiance to the emperor, at this time Henricus IV, followed by his treacherous son Henricus V, covering the period 1056 to 1125. But in fact, each was jockeying for position against the emperor and the shifting alliances among his peers. Several, those of Saxony, Swabia, and Bavaria, actively coveted the imperial crown for themselves. This Western Empire was no empire at all. It was a volatile confederation whose internal political energies and military capacities were consumed by its own dynamics. The empire was only slightly more real in northern Italy, its second component. Outside the autonomous papal state, the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, the old Carolingian power structures were in decay. The old Frankish families had either died out or had been assimilated to the local warrior aristocracy. The counts, as elsewhere, had been deserting the cities over the previous century to build castles and towers to shore up their families' dominion over the countryside. The cities, meanwhile, fell back into the hands of their natural caretakers, the bishops, whom we have seen since Roman times had been the default reference for the functions of civil governance, where imperial and then regnal magistrates were lacking. This pattern pertained over wide areas of Latin Christendom, in Gaul, Iberia, and elsewhere. Bishops routinely ruled the walled cities. They did so by their obvious claim to legitimacy to represent the interest of the populace, and by attracting a clientele of the greater families who acted as their officers. Thus we have families of hereditary functionaries bearing the name of their office, such as the Visconti, in the place of the count, and the Avvocati, legal advocates at trials. This urban equilibrium was upset in the 1000s by two wider developments. First was the reopening of the trade routes to the centre of the whole Mediterranean world, Constantinople. This made the northern Italian cities once more the pivots and the entrepôts between the Mediterranean east and Europe north of the Alps, and led to a surge in private wealth. The second was the direct confrontation by the papacy of the power of the emperor to appoint the bishops as his vassals. Sitting bishops, the keystones in the traditional urban power balance, were contested, delegitimized, and ousted by their rivals, back and forth. Now an imperial client would occupy the episcopal throne, now a papal one. The ecclesiastical battleground of the investiture struggle, as it has been called, lay in the cities of northern Italy. In Milan, the Patarini, a pro-reform faction of the cathedral chapter, led open revolts against their bishop. Their program and methods were imitated in cities across northern Italy. Into this context of the collapse of episcopal legitimacy came the rising groups of citizens who were benefiting from trade and the rise in agricultural productivity. They found their way barred by the warrior lords in the countryside, by the established clienteles around the bishop's palace, by the emperor's magistrates when they were present. Questions of rights to property, to levies, to free passage on rivers, etc., all came to the fore in the effervescence of economic growth. Political and legal institutions to resolve these disputes were weak, or they were not impartial, but themselves actors in the struggle. The result was chaos, sporadic violence, and generalized insecurity. All Europe, by the mid-1000s, was in this fashion prey to the natural dynamics of anarchy and suffered a breakdown of social order and personal security. The Truce of God movement, as we have seen, was an increasingly respected counterforce to try to contain this anarchy through religious sanction. One of its side effects was the resolution by a community to keep the peace among themselves by swearing an institutio pacis, an institution of peace, sometimes called a swearing together, a conjuratio. Such oaths were imposed by religious leaders upon local warrior gentry. They were also spontaneously taken by groups of citizens among themselves. Such actions to impose peace were a feature of a society that had long lost the marks of a tribal form of social organization. They were seeking new ways to re-establish order in the absence of any overarching legitimate power capable of enforcing its decisions. Just as the papacy was holding up the ideal of the unity of and peace among all Christians as a religious injunction, simultaneously in cities across Christendom, leading citizens were forming conjuraciones, or sworn associations of interest and order. The impulse in both cases was the same, the hunger for security, for relief from the chronic fear of for one's livelihood, one's property, and for one's life. For this is the condition engendered by anarchos, anarchy, the absence of rule, of an overriding power to deliver and enforce justice. Present-day anarchists might take note. In 1069, the people of Le Mans in Maine, in northern France, formed a conspiratio, quote, which they called a commune, and they bind themselves together by oaths, end quote. The good people of Lone, not too far away, suffered as the local knights and the clergy, with family ties between them, oppressed them and the vine growers of the surrounding fields. Quote, there was no municipal jurisdiction, and the functions of the various courts had no precise definition in common law. It was possible to strike, insult, and sequestrate, hold to ransom, and kill one's fellows with complete impunity, and neither persons nor property were safe. End quote. From Charles Petit du Thais, 1978. In the charters these citizens drew up expressing their union, the scribes alternately used the terms communia and pax as interchangeable. The idea of the commune was being born, and with it the foundations of European civil society, of the rule of law, and the basis for representative democracy in the Western tradition. The economic upswing, the collective memory of ancient civil institutions, and above all the investiture struggle, and with it the need for a legitimate legal order, opened up space for the citizens themselves to organize a solution. Their leaders, or leaders of sworn factions among them, came forward to form panels of adjudicatores, adjudicators performing the service of conciliating a compromise between two parties in dispute, who were willing to accept their decision. Availing of their impartial services and obeying their decisions would avoid the mutually damaging recourse to violence and to family feud. With time, and in the decades around the turn of the year 1100, these adjudicators gained the power to impose their judgments, even on those who refused to submit to their adjudication. Such a recalcitrant in a legal case would be judged in default, lose the case, and be excluded from the protection of the law and from the justice available to the community. He would be an outcast and an outlaw, literally. The adjudicators came to be known as judici, or judges. As the institution solidified, the judici became subject to the general governance of a committee of two or more consoli, or consuls. The consuls were entrusted by the people, il popolo, with the administration of an impartial justice, with the care of the res publica, the common interests of the community as a whole. The popolo, or arregno as it was called, was the name of the general assembly of the citizens before the main church, to vote for the magistrates and assent to or dissent from the most serious public decisions made by the consuls. The consuls were empowered to raise levies to pay for the repair of the city walls, to order the raising of a militia in each parish, to guard the gates and mount a night watch. They were entrusted with the power to plan a foreign policy for the community, by applying to the bishop, emperor, and the local counts for rights to levy taxes on markets, on fluvial traffic, on water mills, and to exert their control over the surrounding countryside and its villages, which was called the comitatus, or county, later known as the contado. The struggle between the Pope and the Emperor had a similar loosening effect on the constitution of the empire north of the Alps. The emperors granted to cities loyal to them the status of direct legitimacy and immunity from local control. They were Reichsunmittelbar, directly under the authority of the emperor. These cities were also known as Reichsfrei, imperial free, a seemingly contradictory term in our political language. It meant that the emperor was far away and was politically weak, while the local lords were kept at bay, thus making the town nominally subordinate to the empire, but in practice self-governing and free. It should be remembered that in this period, urbanization in the region of Germania was still largely a remnant of Roman antiquity and restricted to the south and west, to the Rhine and the Danube areas. Even more directly, the investiture conflict weakened the emperors vis-à-vis the community of their great barons and bishops, the Fürsten. The Hoftag, or court day, when they assembled around their nominal and sacral president, was also known as the conventus, or the parlamentum. This is where we derive our term parliament from. From Romano-Frankish tradition, they had had an advisory role vis-à-vis the imperial power. The anointed representative of the sacral family, the stirps regia, and their assent to the decrees of the emperor gave them legitimacy. As they were also contenders for power, as well as supporters of that power, the investiture struggle turned this institution of the parlamentum or conventus into the forum for a concerted political opposition to the crown. The parlamentum, also known as diet, effectively became the institution circumscribing the exercise of executive regnal power. The concepts and institutions of a community bestowing political power over themselves to an individual, and then limiting that individual's practice of power by granting or withholding collective consent, was emerging. The political basis of European constitutional governance was taking root in the soil of society. It was this society that Pope Urban II called upon in 1095 to embrace a universal internal peace among all Christians, the Pax Dei, and to take the cross and go to the aid of their fellow Christians in the Roman East, to extirpate the Seljuks enslaving them, and to retake the city of Jerusalem for Christendom.
Ô Fils de Dieu, il importe que sans tarder vous vous portiez au secours de vos frères qui habitent le pays d'Orient. En effet, comme la plupart d'entre vous le savent déjà, un peuple venu de Perse.
The kingdom of Francia, or Francie, was small, and its king remained under the ban of excommunication. But half of Latin Christendom, the Western Roman Empire, could not participate in the First Crusade because its political system was in the throes of conflict unleashed by the investiture conflict, and was resolving into the political formations we have outlined above, into an imperium circumscribed by the great regional lords and bishops of the imperial diet, and into the constellation of autonomous and in Italy independent city communities, the self-governing communes. The result was that in 1096 the second layer of counts and dukes set out on the iter, or the going, the pilgrimage expedition to the Terra Sancta, the Holy Land. These counts were largely drawn from outside the lands of the Western Empire. They came from Burgundy, Lorraine, Flanders, Aquitaine, north-central France, and from Normandy. The brother of the Norman King of England, Robert Courteheuse, being their leader, as well as from Norman southern Italy, led by Tancredo. Urban had made it clear what was at stake. Quote, "They," meaning the Seljuks, "have occupied more and more of the lands of the Christians, and have overcome them," that is the Romans, "in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue with impunity in this way for much longer, the faithful of God will be more widely attacked by them." End quote.
Urban had a very powerful sense, I think, of the Muslim threat to Europe. And it was a threat. It was a very real threat. Therefore, his crusade can only be seen in terms of rolling back the tide of Islam, which he knew had swept across the Mediterranean many centuries before.
The crusade was an offensive expedition made necessary to shore up what was an emergency for all Christendom, as the Roman Empire reeled back to the Bosphorus under the successive devastating advances of the Seljuks across Roman Christian Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. Those who came forward in response to the impassioned preaching must have done so amid scenes similar to an American Pentecostalist meeting, with the volunteers succumbing to the crowd hysteria and the persuasiveness of the preacher's message, by stepping forward as one enraptured, amid the swelling support of the congregation, to become their hero, their representative, as someone admired and even envied by those who wished they had had his courage and purity of motivation, his sense of being chosen. The volunteer made a solemn public vow and literally took the cross, in imitation of Simon Cyrene, taking the burden of Jesus' cross as he made his way to the place of crucifixion, by having a blood-red cloth cross sewn on the shoulder of his tunic. This symbol had, of course, long been the Christian symbol par excellence, but now it became the emblem of Christendom itself, and was to become a permanent feature of European iconography. Indeed, many of the national flags of Europe today bear explicit Crusader crosses, such as all the flags of Scandinavia, as well as that of the United Kingdom, which has 3 superimposed crucifixes, and of historic regions such as Savoy and the cities of Italy such as Milan and Genoa, to name but a few. The call to travel the 3,000 kilometers to the Middle East, in an age when very few people traveled more than 50 km from their homes in their whole lifetime, was taken up with a wave of fervent enthusiasm. Unauthorized preaching by wandering millennialists like Pierre l'Ermite, Peter the Hermit, and his follower Gauthier Sans-Avoir raised thousands of ordinary people to undertake the journey. Several of these millennialists, such as Gottschalk and Volkmar, went against explicit papal and imperial prohibitions and led their mobs viciously to attack Jewish communities along their route, to extract money but also to wreak vengeance on any religious outsiders. These had been the first serious anti-Jewish incidents for the previous 400 years. The so-called People's Crusade numbered more than 12,000 poor people, traversed Hungary, and were shipped across the Hellespont by the Roman Emperor. Many thousands of them were to be massacred by the cavalry of the Turkish Bey, Çelik Arslan, soon afterwards. The comital leaders of the crusading armies, converging at Constantinople under Godefroy de Bouillon and Raymond de Saint-Gilles, were ferried across the Bosphorus by the Emperor Alexius. They clashed with the Turks at Nicaea and later at Dorylaeum, winning both battles. Crossing central Anatolia to the south coast, there was a constant trial from hunger and from Turkish attacks, but they reached Antioch in late October 1097. Besieging it for months, the Christians began to starve to death in large numbers, while those in the town continued to be supplied through the port. A Roman fleet sent from Constantinople under the command of a fugitive member of the Anglo-Saxon royal family, Edgar Atheling, saved the situation. Antioch fell on the 2nd of June. A major Muslim army besieged them in turn, but was defeated and put to flight. It took another whole year for the remnant of the original armies to make their way down the Levantine coast, with many quarrels and hardships along the way. They arrived at Jerusalem in July 1199. Scorched earth and the policy of poisoning the wells outside the walls again brought the Crusaders to the brink of famine and disaster. They had no siege equipment, and the land all around had been stripped bare. Again, salvation came miraculously and unexpectedly from the sea. A small squadron of Genoese galleys, which have come on their own initiative under the brothers Embriaco, provided water and then wood obtained from the breaking up of their galleys, which they carried inland to the siege. The Genoese deployed their specialist skill in the use of the crossbow or ballista to counter the Muslim archers on the walls, and then led the building of several large siege towers clad in animal hides, from which the knights could overwhelm the walls. Jerusalem fell to the besiegers on the 15th of July in the final year of the 11th century. A terrible massacre ensued. This event is held up today as summing up all that needs to be said about the whole of the 600-year-long crusading movement. We apply our modern concept and modern experience of genocide to condemn it. we see it as carried out by blind fanatics in the mistaken belief that they were fulfilling the wishes of the Christian God of peace and love. There can be no doubt that a massacre did happen, and that it stands as an appalling deed. But to begin to comprehend what happened, and not just to condemn it, we need to set these events into some objective historical context. Only very slowly, over many centuries, and with some extreme instances of reversal, have our cultural norms come to outlaw the casual killing of non-combatants in circumstances of war. Be that as it may, but in human history, mercy towards the attacked and the conquered has not been a conspicuous feature of warrior behavior. This is often still the case today. In the past, for a walled city to close its gates and fight off a determined siege was often a death sentence in itself. For a real greatest crime in human history, we can take as a benchmark the moral attitude of the Mongol Khan Hulagu on taking Baghdad in 1258. The low estimate of those men, women and children whom his troops quite slowly and methodically massacred is put at 90,000. A high estimate is 200,000. In 1401, another Central Asian warlord, Timur or Tamerlane, massacred about 20,000 of the population of Damascus. A steep mountain of their heads was piled up outside the city. As we have amply seen in the foregoing episodes, the massacre of the male and the mass enslavement of the female citizens of Christian cities had been routine practice of the armies of invading Islam over the previous 400 years. This was a settled policy option deciding the fate of a conquered people since the time of the Prophet. Indeed, from the 900s onwards, Islamic religious authorities began to formalize in writing the practices of jihad against the idolaters. They laid down what was required, what was forbidden, and what was allowed. When a city fell that had not submitted when called upon to do so. We recall Aram al-Marakushi's boast concerning the fall of Syracuse in 878, that, quote, more than 4,000 barbarians were killed there, and never in another city of polytheism was there so much booty. None of the men were spared, end quote. Genoa had suffered this atrocious fate in 934, when 5,000 of its citizens were killed, and 7,000, mostly women and children, were transshipped to North Africa as slaves. The Muslim distinction between the status and therefore the fate of men and that of women was fundamental to their behavior. In Christian practice, too, mercy at the end of a bloodily fought siege could be in very short supply. We have seen how, after the religious exaltation that drove the East Roman, most people would say Byzantine, siege of Heraklion in 961, there had followed a general massacre of the Muslim inhabitants of that city. In Europe itself, a brutal etiquette of siege warfare was practiced. The breaching of the wall was the deciding point. Before things had got to that stage, the inhabitants would receive tolerable treatment if they opened the gates. Once the wall was breached, however, and a general assault began, matters were entirely different. It usually became an extremely bloody affair. After that point, the inhabitants' lives might be spared. Continued resistance after the breach brought on a general massacre. A general massacre happened in Jerusalem that day. A large proportion, if not most, of the inhabitants were cut down in the heat of the assault and the continued and successful resistance of the citadel. The remainder, and there was a remainder, we don't know how many, were led off to be sold as slaves. In many respects, not an unprecedented story. The massacre that occurred on the 15th of July, 1099, was a very bad one, but it does not merit being singled out, as it often is, as one of the most unexampled crimes in human history. We can say that it was much worse than usual. It is most likely that there were almost no Christians left in Jerusalem by 1099. By a treaty between Michael IV, the Emperor of Constantinople, and the Caliph of Cairo, the Romans had paid for the rebuilding of part of the walls of Jerusalem after the earthquake that had occurred in 1036. They did so provided that the wall was built around the quarter of the city occupied by the Christian community there, who were mainly Greeks and Syrians, near the Holy Sepulchre. This was intended to protect and allow them to lead an independent life within the surrounding Muslim city. This was done. But soon the security of the internal wall, wished for by the emperor, became the reality of a communal prison, a place of confinement, of segregation and collective humiliation. By 1096 a severe persecution of the Christians was instigated, entailing the execution of many of them and a state of near siege around their quarter. Most of the families had fled by 1099, taking with them only what they could carry. The Christian quarter was almost empty when the Crusaders broke in upon the city in 1099.
The news of the fall of Jerusalem was slow to filter back to Europe. Pope Urban, who had launched the whole project and was its nominal commander, died on July 29th. The ships bearing messengers had not reached Rome. When they did, joy was soon unbounded all across Christendom. The news was received at Constantinople with a mixture of joy and unease. For 4.5 centuries the people and emperors of Constantinople had yearned for such a moment. The once unbeatable enemies of Christ had been laid low. But now that this had come to pass, it was disturbing that the Holy City had not been delivered to the emperor, or by the emperor, but by what they perceived to be non-Roman Christians. The holy places were not reunited to the empire, and all was not right with the world. Immediately after the victory, the now greatly diminished Christian force at Jerusalem heard that a large Fatimid army was coming from Egypt, the heart of Muslim power in the Levant, and had reached Ascalon, 60 kilometers south of the city. The Crusaders learned from the remaining inhabitants, that is, not all had been killed, the whereabouts of the true cross, placed there by Emperor Heraclius in 630 AD. With this holiest of Christian relics borne aloft in front of them, they marched south to confront the force of 50,000 Muslims under Vizier al-Malik al-Afdal Shah. The Crusaders were outnumbered 3-1. As they had shown at Antioch, their fighting spirit, their battle-hardenedness, enabled them to put their much larger adversaries to rout, and the Saracens had to withdraw back to Egypt. Thereafter, flushed with their scarcely credible success, the Crusaders returned to Jerusalem and set up a patriarchate, and on the 22nd of July 1099 they elected and crowned Godefroy de Bouillon as the first king of the new Kingdom of Jerusalem, a title that was to ring down the centuries as a near-mythic institution. To say that the Greek Orthodox Church was excluded and suppressed by the Crusaders in Jerusalem, as is usually said, retrospectively presumes that a clear and formal schism already existed between the East Roman Christianity and its Occidental variant, which was far from being the case in 1099. That split into two institutionally segregated and hostile churches was to emerge gradually, largely as the result of the replacement of Roman imperial power in the Near East by the rising power of the Latins. Latin Christendom had begun to take on a new shape. It was at its core very much the entity it had been under Charlemagne. Today's Italy, France, West Germany and northern Spain. More recently integrating components that were Scandinavia, Norman England and southern Italy, Bohemia, Hungary and western Poland. In the final decades of the 1000s AD, it had spectacularly re-annexed major parts of what had long been lost to Islam. Calabria, Apulia and Sicily, central Spain down to Toledo,
and now followed by 4 new Latin principalities in the Levant, or Outre-mer, beyond the sea as it was called. The county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Occident had leaped over the Roman Empire at Constantinople and was implanting itself, its castles, its military, religious, legal and social systems, and its way of life in the Near East, in the revered holy places, the origin and one-time heartlands of Christianity. The Romans at Constantinople called these settlers frangoi. The Muslims took this up and referred to them indiscriminately as franj. By the way, it may be of interest that at the other end of Europe, the Irish also called the Norman conquerors of England Francach, meaning Frank as well. On all sides, people from the Occident were still perceived as being Frankish. Their common characteristics struck outsiders far more clearly than any ethnic, linguistic, or regional variations among them. To the Romans of the East, they were a single ethnos and nation. In the Levant, or Outre-mer, the Frankish soldiers, merchants, and their servants developed a vernacular dialect to ease communication. This was a bastardized mixture of Romance speech based on Northern Italian, and they called it the lingua franca, the Frankish tongue. This is the origin of our use of this term in modern speech. Frank still retained its more ancient association with the idea of being free as opposed to being a slave. Thus we have our terms to enfranchise, to liberate, and of frankness, to be open and unconcealing, as a free man ought to be. A project was afoot to render the Near East Christian once again. To the modern mind, this appears wholly unrealistic and a bit mad. But in 1100 AD, it was not so crazy an idea. We forget that, even after 4 centuries of Islamic dominion, large parts of the Near East, and almost all of modern Turkey, were still populated by Christian communities. The Crusaders passed through towns in Palestine which were Muslim and others which were Christian. There remain in Lebanon and along the Levant today very significant Christian communities. If we turn to consider what was happening in central Spain at this time, we can appreciate that re-Christianization was not an unrealistic project. In the 900s and 1000s AD, central and southern Spain, Al-Andalus, were in most respects just as thoroughly Islamic as were Syria, Palestine and Egypt. What mattered for their respective long-term civilizational destinies was their military strategic setting and the balance of forces. Behind Al-Andalus lay Muslim North Africa as the source of its strength and its guarantee of reserves. Behind and around the Latin principalities of Outre-mer lay the vast reservoirs of Islamic population and power in central Syria, Kurdistan, Mesopotamia, Iran and Afghanistan, not to mention Egypt and Arabia itself. We have seen how in northern Spain King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, even before calling the crusade, had gone on to the offensive and conquered outright the taifas, or Islamic small kingdoms, of north-central Al-Andalus, taking Toledo in 1085. With the Christians on the river Tagus, the remaining emirs of the taifas of the heartlands of the Muslim south, that is Seville, Cordoba, Valencia, etc., took fright. They knew they were next. So it was that immediately after the fall of Toledo, the emir of Seville, Al-Mutamid al-A, journeyed to Marrakesh, to the man who had received the title of Amir al-Muslimin, the commander of the Muslims, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, to invite him to send an army to Spain. Yusuf was the ruler of an immense Almoravid dominion, which stretched from sub-Saharan Ghana all the way up through Morocco and into western Algeria. Yusuf personally founded the cities of Marrakesh and Algiers. The Almoravids were a confederation of Berber tribes which had adopted the strict Quranic literalist teachings of Abdallah ibn Yasin of Kairouan. Severe implementation of Sharia was instituted among the Berbers. Islamic rigor brought social discipline to the Berber tribesmen, and united them under the Almoravid dynasty, placing in that dynasty's hands a most formidable and expansionary military force. We have seen this religious military dynamic and its transformative effects on nomadic tribesmen before, in the original case of Muhammad's coming to power in Arabia in the 630s. Yusuf came to Spain explicitly to wage a war of jihad against the infidels. Yusuf brought his large army across the Straits of Gibraltar in 1087 and met the considerably smaller forces of Alfonso VI at Al-Zalaka. The Christian knighthood braved the massed forces of Africa and the Maghreb, arrayed in front of them, and charged. They were cut to pieces. Al-Zalaka means the place made slippy from the blood of the slain. It was a disastrous setback for Christendom, as it was for Alfonso. He retreated north of the Tagus and sought to defend Toledo. Fortresses were built in the hills south of the city, such as that at Calatrava. The entry of the Almoravids into the peninsula under the banner of jihad put an end to the era of so-called religious decadence of the emirs of the taifas, who had been willing to pay the parillas, or tribute, to the infidels, and also to engage in alliances with them against other princes of either religion, as advantage prompted. From 1087 onwards, the power struggle in the Iberian Peninsula was explicitly one of jihad from the perspective of the Almoravids, to be answered by the call of crusade by the Christians. What gave the Christians some respite after the calamity of Al-Zalaka was that Yusuf had to hasten back to Marrakesh to deal with the dynastic challenge. Subsequently, he devoted much of his political energies and military resources to sweeping aside the decadent emirs of the Taifas and seizing their dominions, thereby uniting under a single hand all of Muslim Al-Andalus once more. Further calamities befell the Christians. The semi-autonomous Principality of Valencia, conquered by the champion knight Rodrigo de Vivar, known to legend as El Cid, was being ruled by his widow, Ximena, since his death in 1099. The county of Valencia fell to the Almoravids in 1102. In all, there were 4 successive landings from Africa of new Almoravid armies in Spain during these decades. It looked as if a century of Muslim division and vulnerability had definitively ended, and that the dreaded days of Al-Mansur had returned, when the Christian cities of the northern coast would again fear devastation, slaughter, and enslavement. It is in all likelihood in the relatively, I stress relatively, religiously relaxed period of the Taifas that the Christian nobility of the north mingled with their Muslim allies in Al-Andalus to learn the game of chess. The term checkmate comes from the Persian shah mat, meaning dead king, indicating a Sassanid origin for the game transmitted across the Islamic Ummah. Modern liberal Spanish historiography speaks of the ideal of la convivencia, conviviality, literally living together. And some practical arrangements for living together, or convivencia, had been worked out in the new lands recovered by the Christians from Islam, that is, in central Iberia and in the coastal regions of Syria and Palestine. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the 3 other Latin principalities of Outremer, the indigenous Christian communities were freed of the burden of paying the hated jizya, or tax on infidels. Christians could practice their religion openly and in public for the first time in 400 years. They could build churches and ring bells. Their testimony and law could not be negated any longer by the word of a Muslim. But these resistance-hardened communities of dhimmi resented the high-handed imposition of superior ecclesiastical authorities over their own. The newly appointed Latin bishops were strangers to them, and their own clergy were naturally uncooperative in subordinating themselves to that authority. 4 centuries of living as the discriminated against dhimmi, or protected, had massively reduced the proportion of Christian communities remaining in Syria and Palestine. The reality was that Muslims, both settlers and converts, made up the majority of the population. The numerically very thin layer of Crusader nobles, knights, castellans, clergy and merchants reproduced a strict hierarchical structure among themselves of lordship and vassalage, of benefices granted and loyalties reciprocated. The Muslim villagers lived under this crust of European feudal networks, but continued to practice their religion to settle their disputes before the Qadi, or Islamic judge, and to listen to their imams preach to them at Friday prayers. They paid the Islamic taxes on land, mediated through their own religious authorities. Although the Crusaders consolidated their position by taking most of the towns along the coast to link the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the county of Tripoli and on up to Antioch, they remained few in number. A call by Pope Paschal II raised another levy of Christians to go to the east to reinforce their brothers already there. In 1101, several large groups set out for Constantinople and for the Terra Sancta, passing through Asia Minor. En route, they were decimated by the Seljuk Turks, and only a remnant reached Antioch and Jerusalem in 1102. Although the presence of the Crusaders helped the Roman Empire to extend its territories into Asia Minor from the coast, the fact remained that the land route across Anatolia to the Levant remained too dangerous. This forced the logistical and communications links between Europe and the four Latin principalities to be by sea. In this regard, the taking of the best defensible port on the Levantine coast, Saint-Jean d'Acre, otherwise known as Acre, became a vital lifeline. This city took on the character of a European one, dominated by quarters housing colonies from Genoa, Venice, and the other naciones, or political communities. The military situation in central Spain was equally precarious in the opening decade of the 1100s. The Almoravids of North Africa and Al-Andalus constituted an immense power that threatened all of Christian Spain. Alfonso VI of Castile appealed to aid from the Christians of the north. In 1102, Pope Paschal II granted the crusade indulgence to those going to the wars being waged in Spain. Help came from the Counts of Burgundy, Raymond and Henri, who married Alfonso's daughters. The old king died in 1109 following a wound he received fighting the Almoravids at Sahagún. To an observer in 1109, it would have appeared that Spain might be lost again, while the long-term prospects for a Latin Christian Levant looked more promising. Here is the opening stanza of a crusading recruitment song from northern France at this period. Chevalier, multestes guaris, quand Dieu a vous fait sa clamour, des Tours et des Almoravis, qui li ont fait tels déshonneurs. Knights, you are much privileged when God makes his cry to you, the Turks and the Almoravids who have done him so much dishonour. Very wrongly have they seized his lands. Well may you feel sorrow for it, for there was God first adored and recognized as Lord. The tide in Iberia began to turn when another and related Alfonso, this one the first of Aragon and Navarre, came to the throne. Aragon and its neighbour, the county of Barcelona, had been largely passive during the decades when the Castilians and Leonese had been reconquering central Spain. The Muslims still held power on the lower Ebro, with their centre at Zaragoza, as it had been in the days of Charlemagne. In 1118, the Church Council of Toulouse declared a crusade for the reconquest of Zaragoza. Alfonso led this campaign and through a life spent in battles and sieges gained the sobriquet of Batallador, the battler. Zaragoza fell in late 1118, followed in the succeeding years by a string of fortified Muslim towns in the area to the south and west of Barcelona. In 1125, Alfonso launched a great raid deep into Al-Andalus, taking back with him, it is said, many of the Christian dhimmi population of the south. His crusading energy carved out a project for Aragon, directed at regaining Valencia, and placing his kingdom alongside those of Castile, Leon, and Portugal as contenders for conquest at the expense of the Muslims. In these conquests, the Muslim population either chose to flee further south or were suffered to continue to live alongside the Christian immigrant communities resettled from the north. Often they suffered punishments after a siege, such as the large population of Zaragoza having to leave their homes and live outside the walls in 1118. Meanwhile, in the heartlands of Latin Christendom, the great decades-long struggle between the resurgent papacy and an undermined Western Empire continued. The issue of the investiture controversy was the clash between the traditional practice of the emperor or king receiving the feudal allegiance of a new bishop by bestowing on him the symbols of his office, the crozier and the ring. The struggle had been going on since 1075. The papacy established the constitutional institution to ensure its own independence by formalizing the system of the cardinal bishops, that is, those of the diocese immediately surrounding the city of Rome, the 7 suburbiacan bishops of Ostia, Porto, Albano, Palestrina, Silva Candida, Labicum and Velletri. These alone were to have the power to elect a new pope, thus making the papacy into a self-regenerating elective monarchy to this day. The political ecclesiastical concept of this new papacy was of a broad principium or primacy over all the bishops of Christendom, Eastern as well as Western. This cut right across the vassalic relationship between the Western Emperor and the bishops of Italy and Germany. The historian Geoffrey Barraclough referred to the crusade as, quote, the foreign policy of the reformed papacy, unquote. With the instruments of the remission of all sins for those who died in the cause of Christ, in providing the religious and political rationale for the expedition to the Holy Land and for the campaigns in Spain, the papacy had provided an ordering magnetic pull which aligned the latent energies of Europe and projected them outwards, thereby bringing a degree of internal peace and security to the society as a whole. The Pope himself was formally the commander of all crusading undertakings. The princes of the Levant were nominally his vassals. The Church had organized the institutions of its own independence and firmly laid claim to an exclusive command of the whole Western episcopacy, to the detriment of secular rulers. It was critically undercutting the power and standing of the institution of the Western emperorship, a weakening that would change the course of history. It claimed primacy over the Patriarchate of Constantinople and over the ancient bishoprics in the lands regained from the Muslims. Perhaps above all, it set forth a concrete and coherent program for the whole of Latin society. The peace of God at home, the regaining of the holy places in the East, the surpassing of the Roman Empire there as the champion of Christendom, the regaining of Spain, and ultimately the Christianization of still pagan East Europe itself. The Reformed papacy gave European society a great all-encompassing project. Through many vicissitudes and triumphs, the society attempted to implement that project over the next 200 years, creating a religious, political and cultural dynamism that deepened and broadened European civilization to become what we know as the Great and High Middle Ages.